the scientists pull the wool over your eyes. If you ever take that Latin stuff they're talking about and convert it into English, it all kind of comes out sounding like duh. For example, this egg tube that the egg goes down is called the egg tube. Of course, we call it oviduct because that has a better lilt to it, oviduct. But it's the egg tube. At the end of the egg tube, you see this funnel-like affair? That's called the funnel. Of course, we give it a Latin name, the infundibulum. Doesn't that sound impressive? Infundibulum. If I say funnel, you say, yeah, obviously it looks like a funnel. But if I say infundibulum, you think, wow, what a shame to cover such a brain with hair. It should be out in the open with chrome parts on it like a hot rod engine. And these are the ovaries on each side. They're where the eggs are stored. And to give you an idea of size, those ovaries that you see in blue up there are about the size of an almond nut, not with the shell, just the nut inside. So you got a picture of how big the ovaries are. And once a lady reaches reproductive age, those ovaries will release ova. And those ova will come out about every 28 days if the lady has a normal reproductive cycle. And if you remove one ovary, the remaining ovary has a considerable good sense to go ahead and ovulate every day. Otherwise, they sort of take turns. And the egg, when released, will enter this funnel and go down this tube. And if it gets fertilized, it'll be typically fertilized about here, third way down the tube, and then it'll go down inside the uterus and implant. Well, let's take a look inside of an ovary, just in a drawing, and see what it looks like. Remember, this would be the size of an almond nut, and these are the eggs we've been talking about. And when a baby girl is born, when she herself comes out of the womb, she has all the eggs she's ever going to have in her whole life. She has about 500,000 eggs. Never gets any more. That's it. 500,000 eggs. I guess the Lord figured family of 500,000 ought to satisfy anyone. When she reaches reproductive age, maybe about 15 or so, each month, if she's regular, each 28 days, about 40 of those 500,000 eggs in one ovary or the other will begin to enlarge. The egg itself doesn't enlarge, but the cells around it that are around the outside of the egg, they increase in number. Fluid builds up inside. You end up with what looks like kind of a big cyst. This is the egg here. The rest of these are cells that are associated with the egg. We call that whole thing the follicle. Sometimes you'll hear this called a Graafian follicle. And out of the 40 that begin, roughly 40 every month, typically only one will ovulate. Sometimes more than one will ovulate. And when that happens, there's the opportunity for twins. These would be fraternal twins. In other words, they could be a boy and a girl because it would be two separate eggs, two separate sperm. So they could be as different as any independent pregnancy. Now, when the egg is released, some of these cells of the follicle are left behind, and they form this yellow body here, which will probably not come as a huge surprise to you, is called the what? Have you heard my lecture before? Yeah, but the Latin word, of course, is corpus luteum. And this yellow body is an endocrine gland that produces hormones that are essential for preparing the uterus to receive the fertilized egg if it gets fertilized. The uterus is sort of like a soil. It has to be kind of worked up, nutrients develop in it, sugars. It gets a very rich blood supply. And then if pregnancy doesn't occur, if the egg doesn't get fertilized in the oviduct, a signal comes back to this endocrine gland basically saying, forget about it this time, shut down the factory. And so this yellow gland then breaks down and leaves behind a scar. scar, like all scars, is kind of white, and so they call it the white body, or corpus albicans. And that scar is so big that if you have a microscope slide with a ovary on the slide, you can hold it at arm's length. You don't need a microscope, and you can see the scar. And every 28 days, you get another scar. And so about 6 to 8 months, the whole ovary would, of course, then be one single mass of scar tissue, which would be pretty much the end of life, and kind of brings us to the end of the lecture. If there are any questions, I would... No, think about it. We have a problem here. You cannot accumulate a scar every 28 days. It's so big that you can see it with the unaided eye at arm's length, and the whole organ's only the size of an almond nut. The scar must be completely removed. The only place in the body where scar tissue just vanishes is here. I've got a scar here from walking through a glass door years ago. I'm sure it'll be there to my last day on this earth. Probably everybody in the room's got a scar someplace and is pretty much going to be there, right? Plastic surgeons would love to just make scars vanish. Well, the Lord does it here, and if He didn't, it would be the end of life. You know, what's the name of the fellow that goes around? Michael Behe talks about irreducible complexity. And in fact, he even argues that until he came along with his idea of irreducible complexity, there really was no evidence for intelligent design, because always you could argue that something simpler might have happened first. But he said once he gets to his irreducible complexity, that really proves intelligent design. Well, I like his ideas on that subject. It's just that I have a little different approach here. I call this insurpassable design. In other words, if you don't get rid of that scar, you're done. You can forget about all of the subsequent steps in the development of the baby. You aren't going to get there. And that there would be an enzyme that would totally dissolve this scar is amazing. I've often thought, how would I look at this if I were an evolutionist? And I've come to the conclusion that if I were an evolutionist and I look at this scar being dissolved, and it's the only place in the body it happens, I'd go, an incredible stroke of luck there. This is a cutaway of the whole system: uterus, oviduct, ovary. There's that funnel-shaped end. And the egg must move down